Sometimes the greatest secret a person leaves behind is not hidden in a safe or written inside a will, but quietly living in the heart of a complete stranger. Cold autumn rain drifted gently across the rows of polished granite headstones as Victoria Hayes stepped through the wrought iron gates of Greenfield Memorial Cemetery, carrying a bouquet of white lilies she had arranged herself before sunrise. It had been exactly 3 years since her husband, Charles Hayes, had passed away, yet every anniversary felt strangely unchanged. The world still called her one of the wealthiest women in America, the billionaire widow whose charitable foundation funded hospitals, scholarships, and research centers across the country. Newspapers admired her strength. Business magazines praised her leadership. Investors respected her decisions. But none of them knew that every October she disappeared without security cameras, board meetings, or luxury cars, choosing instead to spend one quiet morning alone beside the only person who had ever made extraordinary success feel wonderfully ordinary. The cemetery rested peacefully beneath towering maple trees whose golden leaves drifted slowly onto the damp pathways. Victoria knelt beside the familiar headstone, carefully placing the lilies beneath Charles's engraved name before brushing a few fallen leaves away with gentle fingertips. She smiled faintly, although sadness still lingered in her eyes. "I kept my promise," she whispered softly. "The foundation helped thousands this year. You would have been proud." The wind answered only with the gentle rustling of branches overhead. For several silent moments she remained there, allowing memories to return without resisting them. Then a quiet laugh interrupted the stillness. It was not coming from nearby visitors. It belonged to a little girl standing several yards away beside another grave, carefully adjusting a small bouquet of bright yellow daisies. She could not have been older than 8. Her blonde hair peeked from beneath a knitted hat as she smiled proudly at the flowers she had arranged with tiny hands. Standing beside her was a tall man wearing a simple navy jacket, holding a weathered umbrella above them both. His expression carried the calm exhaustion of someone who had learned to keep moving through life despite carrying invisible burdens. Victoria politely looked away, believing they deserved the same privacy she valued each year. Yet something unusual caught her attention. The little girl finished arranging the flowers, then quietly walked toward Charles's grave instead of returning to her father. She carefully placed a single white rose beside Victoria's lilies before stepping back with remarkable respect. Victoria looked at the child in surprise. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "I think you may have the wrong grave." The little girl glanced toward her father before answering with innocent certainty. "No, ma'am. Daddy says we always bring one flower here too." Victoria slowly stood, confusion replacing her quiet composure. The man approached with measured steps, removing his umbrella as the rain softened into a fine mist. His eyes met hers with genuine humility rather than hesitation. He did not appear intimidated by her wealth, nor impressed by the famous family name engraved on the stone between them. Instead, he looked like someone who had carried a truth for a very long time. After a respectful silence, he took a slow breath and spoke words that immediately changed everything Victoria believed she knew about the man she had loved. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "your husband asked me never to tell you this while he was alive. But I think it is finally time you knew the truth. I owe my daughter, my future, and every good day we have ever lived to the kindness of the man resting here today." Victoria remained completely still as the man's words settled into the cool autumn air. The gentle sound of rain falling through the maple trees seemed to fade until nothing existed except the quiet space between them. She searched his face, looking for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding, yet she found only sincerity. The little girl stepped closer to her father and slipped her small hand into his. Neither of them looked uncomfortable standing before one of the most recognizable names in American business. Instead, they looked like people carrying a promise that had become too heavy to keep any longer. Victoria slowly glanced back toward Charles's headstone before returning her attention to the stranger. "I do not believe we have met," she said softly. "No, ma'am," he replied with a respectful nod. "My name is Daniel Brooks, and this is my daughter, Emma." Emma smiled politely. "Hello, Mrs. Hayes." Victoria managed a faint smile in return. "Hello, Emma." Daniel looked down at the white rose resting beside the lilies before speaking again. We come here every year on this date. Charles asked me to promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would never allow this anniversary to pass without bringing a flower. Victoria felt a quiet ache in her chest. She had organized every detail of her husband's memorial service, handled every legal document, and read every letter left in his office after his passing. Never once had she found Daniel's name. "Why would my husband ask that of you?" she asked gently. Daniel took a slow breath, but instead of answering immediately, he looked toward the nearby oak trees where fallen leaves covered the walking path like a golden blanket. Because he believed gratitude should outlive the people who inspire it. His voice carried calm conviction rather than drama. Victoria frowned slightly, her curiosity growing stronger with every passing second. "If Charles helped you, why keep it secret from me?" Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "I asked him this same question years ago. He smiled and said that kindness loses something precious the moment it becomes a performance. He wanted the people closest to him to know who he was through the way he lived, not through stories about what he had done." Those words sounded so unmistakably like Charles that Victoria felt tears gathering despite her effort to remain composed. Her husband had often donated anonymously, quietly paying tuition for students or helping struggling families without leaving his name behind. Yet she had never imagined the pattern reached this far. Emma gently tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy?" Daniel smiled warmly at his daughter. "Just another minute, sweetheart." The little girl nodded patiently before looking at Victoria again. "My daddy says your husband was the bravest man he ever met." Victoria's eyes softened. "Did Emma know my husband?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "No. She was only a toddler when they met. Everything she knows comes from the stories I have told her." Victoria studied him carefully. There was no trace of entitlement in his voice, no request for money, no expectation of recognition. Only quiet respect. "Please," she said after a long silence, "tell me how Charles knew you." Daniel's expression grew thoughtful, almost hesitant. "I will," he answered. "But not here." Victoria looked surprised. Daniel continued gently. "The story does not belong beside his grave. It belongs where he first changed my life." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed an old leather envelope, its edges softened by years of careful handling. Holding it with both hands, he looked directly at Victoria. "Before I tell you anything else, there is something Charles trusted me to keep safe until the day you were finally ready to receive it." Edit. Victoria hesitated only briefly before nodding. Together they left the quiet cemetery, following Daniel and Emma along a winding road lined with brilliant autumn trees until they reached a small neighborhood park less than 10 minutes away. The rain had almost disappeared, leaving tiny drops shimmering on wooden benches and playground swings that gently moved in the cool breeze. Emma hurried toward a nearby picnic table where she quietly opened a coloring book, giving the adults a little space without anyone asking her to. Victoria noticed how naturally father and daughter understood each other, communicating with simple smiles instead of many words. Daniel carefully placed the worn leather envelope on the table between them, but he did not open it immediately. Instead, he rested one hand on its weathered surface as though remembering another life entirely. 7 years ago, he began quietly, I was not standing in parks with my daughter. I was sleeping inside my car while trying to convince myself that tomorrow would somehow be better. Victoria listened without interrupting. There was no self-pity in his voice, only honesty. My wife passed away unexpectedly when Emma was barely 18 months old. I had medical bills, legal fees, and more grief than I knew how to carry. I lost my teaching position after taking too much unpaid leave, and before long I was working temporary jobs just to keep food on the table. He glanced toward Emma, who happily colored bright yellow flowers beneath a nearby maple tree. Every decision I made felt like I was trying to stay one step ahead of losing her. Victoria quietly folded her hands together. She had spent years reading financial reports filled with numbers describing poverty, housing insecurity, and family hardship, but hearing one father's story transformed those statistics into something painfully human. Daniel continued. The worst day came when I walked into the courthouse because I believed I might lose custody. I had no attorney I could afford, almost no savings left, and no idea how I was supposed to prove I could provide the stable future Emma deserved. He smiled faintly, as though remembering a miracle he still struggled to explain. That morning, while I was sitting alone in the courthouse hallway, a man sat beside me wearing an ordinary gray coat. He looked like any other visitor waiting for a hearing. We talked for almost 20 minutes. He never introduced himself as a billionaire. He never mentioned his companies. He only asked about my daughter. Victoria slowly lowered her eyes. Even before Daniel spoke another word, she already knew who that stranger had been. When the court session ended, Daniel continued, the judge postponed everything because a volunteer attorney had unexpectedly agreed to represent me without charge. I did not understand why until later that afternoon. He gently opened the leather envelope and removed a neatly folded receipt, a handwritten note, and a faded business card. The attorney quietly told me that someone had anonymously covered every legal expense and asked him to take my case immediately. Daniel looked directly at Victoria with grateful eyes. I followed the address on this card because I wanted to thank whoever had changed our lives. That is when I met Charles for the second time. He smiled as though nothing unusual had happened and simply asked me one question. Daniel paused for a moment before repeating the words exactly as he had remembered them for 7 long years. Did Emma smile today? When I answered yes, he said, then that is all the repayment I will ever need. Victoria looked down at the faded business card resting in Daniel's hand, recognizing the old headquarters address Charles had used long before expanding his company into a global organization. She remembered that modest brick building well. It was where he insisted on interviewing every employee himself during the early years because he believed character mattered more than impressive resumes. Yet in all the stories he had shared over dinner, during long drives, and on quiet evenings beside the fireplace, he had never once mentioned meeting Daniel Brooks. He never told me any of this, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Daniel nodded with complete understanding. He told me he would not. He said that if kindness was real, it should never become a story told to make someone look generous. Victoria smiled sadly. That sentence sounded exactly like Charles. He had always believed that recognition should belong to the people rebuilding their lives, not to those fortunate enough to help. Emma suddenly skipped back toward the picnic table carrying her finished drawing. Daddy, look. Daniel accepted the colorful page with an affectionate smile before handing it to Victoria. The drawing showed 3 large trees standing beside a bright yellow sun. Beneath them were 3 smiling people holding hands, while a 4th person, surrounded by soft golden light, stood nearby with open arms. Who is this? Victoria asked gently, pointing to the 4th figure. Emma answered with innocent certainty. That is Mr. Charles. Daddy says we cannot see him anymore, but people never really leave when they teach us how to love other people. Victoria felt her eyes fill with emotion. Charles had never met Emma long enough for her to remember his face, yet somehow his values had quietly become part of the little girl's childhood. Daniel carefully folded the drawing before speaking again. After the court case, Charles checked on us every few months. Sometimes he would send a book for Emma. Sometimes he would call to ask whether I was still teaching. He always ended the conversation the same way. He would ask whether we were doing all right, and before hanging up, he reminded me to help someone else whenever life finally gave me the chance. Victoria listened in silence, realizing that the man she thought she knew completely had quietly built an invisible legacy that stretched far beyond boardrooms and charitable galas. Why did he make you promise not to tell me? She finally asked. Daniel reached back into the leather envelope and removed another carefully folded piece of paper. Unlike the first documents, this one remained sealed with dark blue wax that had begun to crack with age. Charles's familiar handwriting appeared across the front in neat letters. For Victoria Hayes. Only when the time feels right. Victoria stared at the envelope without touching it. Her husband had written countless letters throughout their marriage, leaving thoughtful notes inside books, brief messages beside her morning coffee, and handwritten birthday cards every year. Yet she had never seen this one. Daniel gently placed it on the table between them. "He gave this to me almost 4 years before he passed away," Daniel explained quietly. "He said there might come a day when grief became lighter than guilt. If that day ever arrived, I was to find you, give you this letter, and finally tell you the truth." Victoria slowly rested her fingertips on the unopened envelope, feeling the textured paper beneath her hand as though it still carried a small part of Charles himself. She looked up at Daniel with quiet uncertainty. "Do you know what is inside?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "No. He asked me to protect it, not to read it." The autumn breeze gently stirred the fallen leaves around the picnic table as Victoria carefully lifted the sealed letter into her hands, suddenly realizing that after 3 long years of believing every chapter of her husband's life had already been written, another chapter was only now beginning to open. Victoria waited until she returned to the quiet library inside the Hayes estate before opening the letter. The afternoon light streamed through tall windows that overlooked the gardens Charles had designed himself, filling the room with the same peaceful warmth he had always loved. She placed the weathered envelope carefully on the polished oak desk where he had written countless speeches, business plans, and handwritten notes during their marriage. For several long moments she simply rested her fingertips on the blue wax seal, almost afraid that breaking it would make this final connection disappear forever. At last she unfolded the letter, immediately recognizing Charles's familiar handwriting. Every graceful stroke of ink carried his unmistakable patience. "My dearest Victoria," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then Daniel has decided your heart is finally strong enough to receive a truth I wanted to protect until the right moment. Please do not be angry with him for waiting. That decision was mine, never his." Victoria felt tears quietly gathering as she continued reading. "You have always known that helping people gave my life meaning, but there were some promises I could never explain without turning another person's private struggle into my own story. Daniel was one of those promises. He did not need admiration. He needed dignity. I could give him both only if our friendship remained unseen." She paused, remembering how often Charles had quietly disappeared for an afternoon, always returning home with the peaceful smile of someone who believed he had spent his time well. She had assumed those hours belonged to business meetings or foundation work. Now she realized many of them had belonged to lives she had never known existed. She continued reading. "There is something else I hope you understand. Wealth can build hospitals, schools, and foundations, but kindness is what allows people to walk through those doors without shame. Never let success become louder than compassion. Promise me that." Victoria gently wiped away a tear before turning to the final page. "One day you may meet Daniel again without me standing beside you. If life places both of you on the same path, do not measure him by what he once needed. Measure him by the father he became, the teacher he continued to be, and the man who kept every promise even after I was gone. He has spent years repaying a kindness I never considered a debt. If he ever brings you this letter, welcome him as someone I trusted completely." Victoria slowly lowered the pages, overwhelmed not by sadness, but by a new understanding of the man she had loved. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Her longtime housekeeper entered carrying a tray with tea before noticing the open letter and Victoria's tearful smile. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Hayes?" Victoria looked toward the window where the late afternoon sun bathed the gardens in soft golden light. "Yes," she answered quietly. "For the first time in a very long time, I think I finally know my husband a little better." Later that evening she carefully placed the letter inside a small wooden keepsake box where she had stored Charles's wedding watch, a pressed white lily from their anniversary, and several handwritten notes collected over the years. As she closed the lid, she noticed one final sentence written across the bottom corner of the last page, so small she had almost missed it. "If you ever wish to discover the rest of my story, ask Daniel to show you the old maple tree by the lake." That is where every promise truly began. Victoria gently touched those final words, realizing that Charles had not left her another farewell. He had quietly left her another beginning. 2 mornings later, Victoria found herself driving away from the familiar skyline of downtown Manhattan toward a quiet lakeside town nearly 60 miles north of the city. Charles had always loved taking the long scenic roads whenever business allowed, insisting that the best conversations happened far away from crowded schedules. As the miles passed beneath the tires, she began noticing small places that seemed untouched by time: family-owned bookstores, white wooden churches, roadside bakeries, and neighborhoods where children still rode bicycles along tree-lined streets. Daniel had agreed to meet her beside the old maple tree mentioned in Charles's letter, but he had offered no explanation beyond saying, "You will understand when you see it." Emma sat quietly in the back seat of Daniel's aging station wagon as they arrived from the opposite direction. She jumped out carrying a small woven basket filled with birdseed, smiling brightly as though this peaceful place had become part of her childhood. Victoria stepped from her own car and looked toward the enormous maple tree standing beside the sparkling lake. Its wide branches stretched gracefully across the shoreline, and beneath them rested a weathered wooden bench overlooking calm water that reflected the soft blue autumn sky. A small bronze plaque had been attached to one side of the bench many years earlier. Victoria slowly brushed away a few fallen leaves until the inscription became visible. It read simply, "Every act of kindness becomes the beginning of another story." She recognized Charles's favorite sentence immediately. Daniel walked beside her and smiled gently. He paid for this bench almost 10 years ago. He never allowed anyone to put his name on it. Victoria looked around in quiet wonder. Several elderly neighbors waved as they passed along the lakeside trail, greeting Daniel warmly. One older gentleman noticed Victoria studying the plaque and smiled. "You knew Charlie?" he asked cheerfully. Victoria blinked in surprise. "You called him Charlie?" The man laughed softly. "Around here everyone did. He used to come every month, feed the birds with that little girl, and spend an hour talking to anyone who needed company." Victoria watched Emma scatter birdseed across the grass while dozens of small sparrows gathered around her without fear. "He never mentioned this place," she whispered. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Because this was the one place where nobody treated him like a billionaire. He preferred being Charlie." They sat together on the old wooden bench as gentle waves touched the shoreline. Daniel looked across the peaceful water before quietly continuing the story. "After he helped me keep custody of Emma, I wanted to repay him somehow. He refused every offer. Then one Saturday he invited us here instead. We spent the afternoon feeding birds, walking around the lake, and talking about ordinary life. Before leaving, he pointed at this maple tree and said something I have never forgotten." Daniel smiled as he repeated Charles's words from memory. "Strong trees never grow because life is easy. They grow because they keep reaching toward the light, even after every difficult season." Victoria looked up through the golden branches swaying gently overhead, suddenly realizing why Charles had sent her here instead of explaining everything inside a letter. Some places carried lessons that words alone could never hold. Emma ran back toward them holding a bright red maple leaf almost as large as her hands. She happily placed it into Victoria's palm. "Daddy says this tree remembers everybody who sits here." Victoria smiled warmly at the child before carefully tucking the beautiful leaf inside Charles's folded letter. As she looked back toward the quiet lake, she noticed something unexpected carved discreetly into the far corner of the old wooden bench. It was not a name or a date, but 3 simple initials that made her heart stop for a moment. CH, and directly beneath them, DB, connected by a small hand-carved line that had quietly survived every passing season. Victoria gently traced the carved initials with her fingertips, feeling the rough texture of the weathered wood beneath her hand. Years of changing seasons had softened the edges, yet the simple connection between the 2 sets of letters remained unmistakable. She looked toward Daniel with quiet curiosity. "Did the 2 of you carve this together?" Daniel smiled, almost embarrassed by the memory. "Actually, Emma did." Victoria turned in surprise. Emma laughed softly as she hugged the nearly empty basket against her sweater. "Daddy let me hold the little carving tool because I wanted both of their names to stay together." Daniel chuckled. She was only 4 years old. Charles pretended not to notice that the line was a little crooked. He told her that perfect memories never need perfect lines. Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment, hearing Charles's familiar sense of gentle humor echo through the years. It was exactly the kind of lesson he would have given a child. As they continued walking beside the lake, Daniel pointed toward a small white boathouse standing quietly along the shoreline. That is where he used to meet several local families every month. Nobody knew he owned major companies. They simply knew him as Charlie, the man who always brought extra sandwiches and never forgot anyone's birthday. Victoria found herself smiling through tears. Throughout their marriage she had admired Charles for his generosity, yet she had never realized how carefully he protected the privacy of the people he helped. He had never wanted gratitude to become obligation. Emma suddenly reached for Victoria's hand as naturally as if they had known each other for years. "Would you like to feed the ducks with us?" she asked hopefully. Victoria hesitated only for a second before smiling warmly. "I would love to." Together the three of them walked to the edge of the quiet lake where dozens of ducks floated peacefully across the shimmering water. Emma happily scattered the last handful of birdseed while laughing each time one curious duck waddled closer than the others. Victoria found herself laughing too, surprised by how unfamiliar yet comforting the sound felt. It had been a long time since laughter had visited her without guilt following close behind. Daniel noticed the change but said nothing. Charles had once told him that healing should never be rushed or announced. It should simply be allowed to arrive. After the birds drifted back toward the center of the lake, they returned to the old bench. Daniel reached into his jacket once again and carefully removed a small leather notebook, much thinner than the envelope but equally worn with age. "There is one more thing Charles trusted me to protect," he said quietly. Victoria accepted the notebook with both hands. The first page contained only a single sentence written in Charles's familiar handwriting. "Every month, write down one quiet act of kindness you witnessed, because goodness disappears only when nobody remembers it." Victoria slowly turned another page. Every entry that followed had been written by Daniel over the past 7 years. Some described neighbors helping elderly couples shovel snow. Others told stories of students standing beside classmates who felt alone, strangers paying for groceries, firefighters comforting frightened children, and teachers quietly buying winter coats for families who could not afford them. None of the pages mentioned money or recognition. They celebrated ordinary people choosing compassion in ordinary moments. Victoria looked at Daniel with growing admiration. "You kept this for 7 years?" Daniel nodded. Charles believed that hope grows stronger when we choose to notice it. Whenever life became difficult, he told me to read these pages instead of the headlines. Victoria gently closed the notebook against her heart, realizing that Charles had not only changed Daniel's future. He had quietly taught another man how to become the kind of father Emma would always remember, and somewhere deep inside, Victoria began wondering whether continuing Charles's legacy might require more than preserving his memory. Perhaps it meant learning to see the world through the same compassionate eyes that had transformed so many lives without ever asking for applause. The drive back to Manhattan felt strangely different from every business trip Victoria had taken during the past 3 years. Instead of reviewing financial reports or preparing for board meetings, she found herself reading Daniel's notebook again as the city skyline gradually appeared beyond the windshield. Every page carried another ordinary story made extraordinary through simple kindness, and with each one she understood Charles a little more clearly. He had never measured success by quarterly earnings or headlines. He had measured it by the number of people who quietly chose compassion after receiving it themselves. That realization stayed with her throughout the following week. During a meeting of the Hayes Foundation, executives presented charts outlining future investments, grant proposals, and expansion plans. Victoria listened carefully before closing the folder in front of her. "I would like to add a new initiative," she said calmly. The room fell silent. "Beginning next year, our foundation will establish the Quiet Kindness Fellowship. It will recognize teachers, nurses, neighbors, volunteers, and ordinary citizens whose acts of compassion often go unnoticed." Several board members exchanged surprised glances. One finally smiled. "How will we measure something like that?" Victoria looked toward the large windows overlooking the city. We will not measure it by publicity. We will measure it by lives changed. After the meeting ended, she drove alone to the elementary school where Daniel taught history. Classes had just finished, and children filled the sidewalks with backpacks, laughter, and excited conversations about homework and weekend plans. Victoria waited respectfully outside until Daniel walked Emma toward the parking lot. Emma noticed her first and waved enthusiastically. "Mrs. Hayes," she called with genuine excitement. Victoria smiled warmly. "Hello, Emma." Daniel looked pleasantly surprised. "I was not expecting to see you today." Victoria held up the leather notebook. "I finished reading every page." Daniel smiled. Charles always hoped someone else would continue writing in it one day. Victoria hesitated for only a moment before answering. "I think I would like that." Emma's face immediately brightened. "Then you have to hear today's story." Without waiting, she happily opened her backpack and pulled out a folded sheet of notebook paper covered in careful handwriting. "Our teacher asked us to write about someone who helped another person." She proudly handed it to Victoria. The short essay described a classmate who quietly shared lunch with another student whose family was struggling financially. There were no dramatic events, only simple generosity offered without expecting anything in return. Victoria looked up from the page with a gentle smile. "This belongs in the notebook." Emma nodded proudly. "Daddy says kindness gets bigger when people remember it." Daniel laughed softly. "She reminds me of Charles more every year." They walked together toward a small neighborhood ice cream shop that Emma insisted served the best vanilla cones in New York. Sitting at a sidewalk table beneath strings of warm lights, Victoria watched Daniel greet nearly every person who passed by. Parents thanked him for encouraging their children. Former students stopped to introduce college friends. Elderly neighbors waved from across the street. None of them seemed impressed by wealth or reputation. They simply respected the quiet teacher who always remembered their names. As the evening sun settled behind the buildings, Victoria realized something unexpected. For the first time since Charles had passed away, she had spent an entire afternoon without feeling that moving forward somehow meant leaving him behind. Instead, every conversation with Daniel and every smile from Emma made Charles feel more present than ever, not because they were replacing him, but because they were living the values he had quietly planted in all of them years before, allowing his kindness to continue growing long after his own footsteps had faded. The Quiet Kindness Fellowship officially launched the following spring, and within weeks the Hayes Foundation began receiving thousands of nominations from every corner of the country. Teachers wrote about cafeteria workers who quietly paid for children's lunches. Nurses described volunteers who visited patients with no family. Firefighters nominated neighbors who rebuilt homes after storms without accepting recognition. Every envelope carried another reminder that compassion often lived far from newspaper headlines. Victoria insisted on personally reading as many letters as possible. Each evening she sat in the same library where Charles's final letter rested safely inside its keepsake box, placing the newest stories beside Daniel's leather notebook. Before long, the notebook that had once belonged only to Daniel had quietly become something they shared. Every month they met at the old maple tree by the lake, adding another handwritten story together while Emma proudly searched for the brightest fallen leaf to place between the pages. Those simple afternoons gradually became the most meaningful appointments on Victoria's calendar. One Saturday, after finishing another entry about a retired mail carrier who secretly delivered groceries to an elderly couple during a harsh winter, Victoria closed the notebook and smiled. "Charles was right," she said softly. "The world is kinder than we usually notice." Daniel looked across the shimmering lake. He always believed hope needed witnesses. Emma skipped ahead collecting smooth stones along the shoreline before suddenly turning back toward them. "Can I ask something?" she said. Victoria laughed gently. "Of course." Emma looked from Daniel to Victoria with complete innocence. "Why do both of you always smile when you talk about Mr. Charles instead of crying?" The unexpected question settled over the quiet lakeside like the gentle breeze moving through the maple branches. Victoria thought carefully before answering. Because love changes after someone is gone. At first it hurts every time you remember them. Then one day you realize their love is still helping people smile, and the sadness slowly makes room for gratitude. Emma seemed satisfied with the answer and happily returned to collecting stones. Daniel watched his daughter for a moment before quietly speaking. She has started asking about her mother more often too. I think children know when healing finally feels safe. Victoria nodded with understanding. Perhaps adults only learn that lesson much later. On the drive back toward the city, Victoria found herself reflecting on the unexpected path her life had taken. She had first met Daniel as a stranger standing beside Charles's grave, believing he carried another secret from the past. Instead, he had quietly become someone who understood grief without needing long explanations. He never tried to replace Charles's memory. He honored it with every story he told Emma, every page he added to the notebook, and every ordinary act of kindness he continued because of one conversation years earlier. A few days later, while preparing for the Foundation's annual gala, Victoria discovered a small package waiting on her office desk. There was no return address, only a handwritten note that read, "For the next chapter." Inside she found a beautifully restored antique pocket watch. She recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Charles's grandfather and had disappeared shortly after Charles passed away. Attached to the watch was another note from the elderly caretaker of the Lakeside Community Center. It read, "Charlie asked me to keep this safe until you no longer needed reminders of loss, only reminders of love." Victoria gently opened the watch. Instead of an engraved family crest, she found a tiny folded piece of paper hidden inside the cover. Her heart began to race as she carefully unfolded it, realizing Charles had quietly left behind one final message that neither she nor Daniel had ever known existed. Victoria carefully unfolded the tiny slip of paper hidden inside the antique pocket watch, almost afraid that a message preserved for so many years might disappear the moment fresh air touched it. Charles's handwriting appeared once again, smaller than before but unmistakably steady. "My dearest Victoria, if this note has found you, then life has already done something I hoped it would. It has reminded you that love is never measured by how tightly we hold on to yesterday, but by how gently we help tomorrow become possible." She paused, allowing every word to settle into her heart before continuing. "If Daniel is still part of your journey, then he has honored every promise he ever made to me. Trust his character the same way I did. He has already proven it many times over." Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment, realizing that Charles had once again been thinking about other people even while preparing for a future he knew he might never see. The final lines were even simpler. "Do not build a monument to my memory. Build opportunities for people who still need hope. That will always be enough." She folded the note carefully and placed it back inside the watch before driving directly to the Lakeside Community Center where the elderly caretaker, Harold Bennett, welcomed her with a warm smile. Harold had known Charles for nearly 15 years and remembered him not as a billionaire but as the quiet man who volunteered during community breakfasts and helped repair broken benches after winter storms. Victoria thanked him for protecting the watch all those years. Harold smiled gently. Charlie always believed that some gifts should arrive exactly when people are ready to receive them, not a day earlier. Later that afternoon Victoria met Daniel and Emma beneath the familiar maple tree. The golden leaves had begun drifting gently toward the lake once again, reminding her how quickly another season had passed. She showed Daniel the hidden message, watching quiet emotion appear across his face as he read the final words. "He never stopped teaching us," Daniel whispered. Victoria nodded. "Even now." Emma looked curiously between them before asking, "What did Mr. Charles say this time?" Victoria smiled and knelt beside her. "He reminded us that helping people is the best way to remember someone we love." Emma considered the answer thoughtfully before reaching into her backpack. "Then I have something too." She carefully removed a small glass jar filled with folded pieces of colorful paper. "My class started a kindness jar. Every time someone helps another person, we write it down." Daniel laughed softly. That idea was entirely hers. Emma proudly handed the jar to Victoria. Maybe the foundation could make lots of these. Victoria held the little jar in both hands, realizing that one child's simple idea carried exactly the same spirit Charles had spent his life encouraging. "I think that is a wonderful idea," she said warmly. Over the following weeks, the Hayes Foundation launched a nationwide kindness jar project for schools, libraries, hospitals, and community centers, encouraging people to celebrate ordinary acts of compassion instead of extraordinary achievements alone. Thousands of jars soon appeared across the country, each one quietly filling with handwritten reminders that goodness continued to exist in everyday life. One evening, after reviewing photographs from schools participating in the program, Victoria looked toward the keepsake box resting on her desk. Inside were Charles's wedding watch, the pressed white lily, the final letters, the bright red maple leaf Emma had given her, and now one small folded kindness note written by a third-grade student. She smiled softly, realizing that Charles's greatest legacy had never been the fortune he left behind. It was the countless people who had chosen to become a little kinder simply because one man believed that quiet compassion could change the world, one heart at a time. Autumn returned once more, bringing crisp air, golden leaves, and another gathering beneath the old maple tree beside the quiet lake. What had begun as an unexpected meeting between strangers had gradually become a tradition neither Victoria nor Daniel ever planned yet neither wished to miss. The leather notebook rested on the wooden bench between them, now noticeably thicker than when Daniel had first placed it into Victoria's hands. Hundreds of handwritten stories filled its pages, contributed not only by the two of them but also by children, teachers, nurses, firefighters, neighbors, and volunteers from every state. Each page proved that Charles's simple belief had continued traveling farther than any of them imagined. Emma, now another year older, carefully added a fresh maple leaf between the newest entries before closing the notebook with gentle satisfaction. "Daddy," she said cheerfully, "I think Mr. Charles would have liked this one." Daniel smiled warmly. "Which story?" Emma pointed toward the final page she had written herself. It described a quiet afternoon when several classmates stayed after school to help a new student decorate a science project because he was too shy to ask for help. Victoria read the short paragraph twice before looking up with pride. "You noticed something beautiful," she said. Emma shrugged with the simple honesty only children possess. "I learned that from both of you." The words settled quietly over the lakeside. Daniel looked across the calm water before speaking in a voice softer than usual. "Victoria, there is something I should have told you a long time ago." She turned toward him with patient curiosity. "You can tell me anything." He folded his hands together for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "After Charles passed away, I almost stopped visiting the cemetery. I thought continuing would only make your grief heavier if we ever met. I even packed away the notebook and the letters because I believed my part of his story had ended." Victoria listened without interrupting. Daniel continued. "Then one afternoon Emma asked why we were no longer bringing flowers. I told her that maybe it was time to let go. She looked at me and said something I will never forget." He smiled gently at his daughter. She said, "Remembering someone is not the same as keeping them from resting." Emma looked slightly embarrassed. "I was little. I do not even remember saying that." Daniel laughed softly. "I do." He looked back at Victoria. "That was the day I realized honoring Charles did not mean staying trapped in sadness. It meant continuing the kindness he started." Victoria felt tears gathering, not from sorrow but from gratitude. She reached into her handbag and carefully removed the antique pocket watch Charles had left behind. The polished silver reflected the afternoon sunlight as she placed it beside the notebook. For a long time, she admitted quietly, I believed loving Charles meant protecting every memory exactly as it was. I was afraid that if my life changed, somehow my love for him would become smaller. Daniel gently shook his head. "He never wanted that for you." Victoria smiled through the emotion in her eyes. "I know. It simply took me longer to understand." Emma quietly slipped her small hand into Victoria's. "My daddy says hearts get bigger instead of replacing people." Victoria laughed softly. Your daddy is a very wise teacher. Daniel smiled but lowered his eyes for a brief moment before speaking again. No. Charles was. I have simply spent the last several years trying to live the lessons he left behind. Victoria looked at him with growing warmth, realizing that the greatest gift Charles had quietly given both of them was not only hope during difficult seasons, but the courage to believe that love could remain faithful to the past while still making room for a future that neither of them had ever expected. Winter arrived quietly that year, covering the lakeside paths with a gentle blanket of snow that reflected the pale morning sunlight. The old maple tree stood peacefully above the frozen shoreline, its bare branches reaching toward the bright sky with the same quiet strength Charles had once admired. Victoria parked beside the familiar trail carrying a small wooden box wrapped in a simple blue ribbon. Daniel and Emma were already waiting near the old bench, bundled in warm coats, their breath visible in the crisp December air. Emma ran forward with her usual cheerful smile. "Mrs. Hayes, we made hot chocolate." Victoria laughed warmly as Daniel lifted a small thermos from a picnic basket. Emma insisted no important conversation should ever happen without hot chocolate. They settled onto the weathered bench, smiling as steaming cups warmed their hands against the winter cold. For several peaceful minutes no one felt the need to speak. Snowflakes drifted gently across the lake while a pair of swans glided slowly through the narrow ribbon of open water near the shore. Finally Victoria placed the wooden box on the bench between them. "I brought something that belongs to all of us now," she said softly. She untied the ribbon and opened the lid. Inside rested Charles's pocket watch, the pressed white lily from their anniversary, the bright red maple leaf Emma had given her, the final letters, and the first handwritten kindness note from the school project. Beside them lay Daniel's leather notebook. "These are the things that carried me through the hardest years of my life," Victoria continued. "But they should not spend the rest of their existence hidden inside my library." Daniel looked at her with quiet understanding. "What are you thinking?" Victoria smiled gently. "The Hayes Foundation is opening its new community learning center next spring. I want to create a small reading room called Charlie's Corner. Not a memorial filled with photographs or awards. Just a peaceful place where children, families, teachers, and neighbors can read stories of kindness, write their own, and remember that ordinary people change the world every single day." Emma's eyes grew wide with excitement. "Can our notebook live there?" Victoria nodded. "Only if the two of you promise to keep adding new pages." Daniel looked down at the worn leather cover before answering. "I think Charles would have loved that." Victoria carefully lifted the notebook and placed it back inside the wooden box beside the keepsakes. "Nothing here belongs to the past anymore. These are seeds for the future." They sat together watching the quiet snowfall until Emma suddenly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out 3 small pine cones she had collected along the trail. She handed one to Victoria and one to her father before keeping the last for herself. "My teacher says pine cones become trees someday," she explained. "Maybe memories work like that too." Daniel smiled proudly. "That may be the wisest thing anyone has said all winter." Victoria looked across the frozen lake, feeling an unexpected sense of peace settle over her heart. She no longer visited places connected to Charles because she was afraid of losing him. She visited because those places reminded her how much of his kindness still lived in the people around her. As they prepared to leave, Daniel quietly offered his hand to help Victoria step across the snowy path. She accepted without hesitation, not because she needed assistance, but because the simple gesture felt natural. Walking side by side toward their cars, accompanied by Emma's joyful laughter echoing through the winter air, Victoria realized she was no longer simply protecting Charles's legacy. She was living it every ordinary day, surrounded by people whose lives had become beautifully connected through one man's quiet decision to choose kindness whenever nobody was watching. Spring returned once again, bringing fresh blossoms to the gardens surrounding Greenfield Memorial Cemetery, where everything had quietly begun more than 2 years earlier. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the maple branches as Victoria walked toward Charles's grave carrying a bouquet of white lilies in one hand and the antique pocket watch in the other. This time she was not alone. Daniel walked beside her at an easy pace, while Emma skipped happily a few steps ahead carrying a small basket filled with fresh flowers she had picked from the community garden that Charlie's Corner now helped support. Nothing about the morning felt heavy. Instead, it carried the peaceful rhythm of a promise faithfully kept. Victoria knelt beside the familiar headstone and carefully placed the lilies beneath Charles's name. She rested the pocket watch beside them for just a moment before smiling softly. "You were right," she whispered. "Kindness really does keep growing." Daniel and Emma stood respectfully a few feet away, allowing her a quiet moment. After several peaceful seconds, Victoria rose and turned toward them with gentle gratitude shining in her eyes. Emma stepped forward first and placed a single bright yellow daisy beside the lilies. "Thank you, Mr. Charles," she said with innocent sincerity. "Because of you, my daddy smiles more now." Daniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment before speaking quietly. "And because of you, I learned that the greatest gift anyone can receive is another chance to become the person they were meant to be." Victoria reached for Daniel's hand, and this time neither of them hesitated. Their fingers intertwined naturally, not as a replacement for yesterday, but as a continuation of everything yesterday had quietly taught them. Several weeks later, the Hayes Foundation celebrated the opening of Charlie's Corner inside its new community learning center. Children filled the bright reading room with laughter while families added handwritten kindness stories into dozens of colorful glass jars lining the shelves. The original leather notebook rested inside a simple wooden display case that visitors could read before adding new pages to its growing collection. Above the entrance hung a modest plaque carrying only one sentence: "Every act of kindness becomes the beginning of another story." There were no statues, no portraits, and no celebration of wealth. Only ordinary stories written by ordinary people choosing compassion every day. As the afternoon celebration came to an end, Daniel invited Victoria and Emma back to the old maple tree beside the lake. Warm spring sunlight danced across the water while gentle breezes carried the scent of blooming wildflowers through the air. The weathered wooden bench remained exactly where it had always been, still holding the carved initials that connected two lives through gratitude and friendship. Daniel stopped beneath the wide branches and looked toward Victoria with calm certainty. "Charles once trusted me with the most important promise of my life," he said softly. "Today I want to make one of my own." He reached into his jacket and carefully removed a simple velvet box. Inside rested an elegant ring chosen not for extravagance but for timeless beauty. Emma smiled knowingly, although she remained quietly beside the tree, giving them the moment they both deserved. Daniel looked into Victoria's eyes. "You never asked me to leave the past behind, and I will never ask you to forget it. The love you shared with Charles helped shape the woman I admire today. I am not asking to replace your memories. I am asking whether you will let me spend the rest of my life honoring them beside you while we create new ones together." Tears filled Victoria's eyes as she smiled through quiet happiness. "Yes," she whispered. "With all my heart, yes." As Daniel gently placed the ring on her hand, Emma clapped with joyful excitement before wrapping both of them in a warm embrace. The spring breeze stirred the maple leaves overhead, the lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, and somewhere beyond the quiet shoreline children laughed inside Charlie's Corner, writing new stories of kindness that would inspire strangers they would never meet. Victoria looked once more toward the distant cemetery before resting her hand over the antique pocket watch tucked safely inside her coat. She finally understood the truth Charles had tried to leave behind all along. Real love never asks us to choose between yesterday and tomorrow. It teaches us to carry the goodness of yesterday forward until it becomes someone else's reason to hope, and in doing so, it quietly transforms every ending into the beginning of another beautiful story.